Over the years, there's been this sort of rumbling about the European Convention, and there's a very vocal bit of the Tory party. And it used to be that there was also a very vocal bit of the Tory party that was against it. So people like Dominic Grieve and the sort of, I think what were described at one point as the Runnymede Tories, referencing Magna Carta. But I think a lot of those people have left. People like David Gork, those sorts of centre-right Tories. I think a lot of them were booted out by Boris Johnson, and many of them will also probably leave during this election. So I wouldn't be totally surprised if you ended up seeing leaving the European Convention become a policy. There will always be strong voices against it because, as I mentioned, the origins of the European Convention were really very Tory. In fact, Labour was against the European Convention for quite a bit in the 50s because they saw it as really about political rights. They wanted social rights. They saw it as a right-wing attempt to avoid giving people social rights, which weren't really included in the European Convention, unlike they are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN the UN agreement, but they're not in the European Convention. So I think there's quite a right-wing background to this. And in fact, if you're in the slightest bit interested in the UK as a international force for good, as an example for, in terms of values, then the European Convention is really where it's at. That's how you promote values to lots of different countries. So I'd really like to think that the Tories won't be extreme enough to pick up on these sort of people like Tim Montgomery, Suella Braverman, who have supported leaving. But after Brexit, I don't think there's any guarantee at all that will be enough.
I'm inclined to agree with you. But Marie, can they make enough people in the country rather than the party care during a cost of living crisis about this?
I'm not convinced they can. And because I think the problem is also, if you look at the referendum on AV, for example, and really look back at how absolutely shameless the campaigning was on that, was it the pictures of the newborn baby saying he needs a new hospital, not a new voting system, with that 300 million or whatever it was. So I think, they would probably do that. But I think the main difference is that they're not arguing for the status quo here. They're arguing for a big change. And I think we've recently, listeners of this podcast in particular, may be aware of the little known fact that we had quite a big change to the status quo in Britain recently, which has not gone tremendously. So it's not clear to me. So I think it's both people have bigger fish to fry at the moment in their kind of day-to-day lives. But also, again, they've taken a gamble. They took a gamble quite recently. It did not go so well. So I'm not convinced you could convince them basically to be like, hey, that went super well. Shall we do another thing kind of at random? Lol.
Adam, what's your sense of which way the Supreme Court is likely to go when they decide this autumn? Are they going to break with the Court of Appeal's ruling in June? Because the Court of Appeal's ruling wasn't unanimous. It was 2-1, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Lord Chief Justice was the dissenter, although he's now he's finished his time. So it was as powerful a dissent as you can get. It's really hard to know with the Supreme Court at the moment. They've certainly not they don't seem to be taking what I'd describe as unexpected decisions in these kind of cases. They have sided with the government and public authorities a lot. And that's certainly my sense since Lord Reid took over from Lady Hale. So it's entirely possible the government will succeed. They've got David Pannick as their barrister, who you may remember is the barrister who won against them in the prorogation case and in the second Brexit case. So it really is on a knife edge. However, I also think, look, in actual fact, the Court of Appeal judgment was pretty simple. It said the law is that you cannot send someone back to a situation where there is a real risk that their rights will be breached, because in this case, Rwanda has a really poor asylum system. And the big question for the Court of Appeal was, do we take the government's assurances, as in our government's assurances, that this system will magically resolve itself, and it's got really sort of quite fundamental issues, including potentially corrupt judiciary? Will it resolve itself in time for whenever, the next few months, by the time they're going to start they want to send people to Rwanda? And the Court of Appeal said, we just can't say that there isn't a real risk that this system will not be resolved. And I'd be really surprised, unless the government pulls a rabbit out of a hat, sort of, they come in with an expert who says, actually, Rwanda have done this incredible job of just completely revising their entire judicial system. In fact, their political system and their asylum system are all now really good. I'd be really surprised if the Supreme Court reaches a different decision, but I've been wrong enough times before.